Please welcome President mPedigree, Bright Simons.
Good afternoon. So I'm here to talk to you about innovation in Africa. But I guess for those of you who have not spent a lot of your life in international travel, I have to justify that. Why should you really care about Africa in the first place? Because if you don't care about Africa, then innovation in Africa doesn't have a whole lot of relevance. There are a few reasons why you need to care about Africa. Because you do care about emerging markets. And if you have any interest in geography at all, you know that Africa has a population bigger than India and Russia combined. That's a big place. 54 countries, population bigger than India and Russia combined. GDP bigger again than India and Russia combined. But what will fascinate some of you is the degree of economic growth that we've witnessed on the continent for the past decade. If I asked you how many companies in the US, private companies in the US, have revenues above $1 billion a year, can somebody take a guess? How many companies in the US has revenues above $1 billion a year? 750. How many companies in Africa have revenues above $1 billion a year? Anybody going to take a stab? 100. Any more? 5. Well, according to the Forbes 2000 list, 220 US companies have revenues above $1 billion a year, private companies, that is. 400 African companies have revenues above $1 billion a year. That is not a small continent. So you better be paying attention. And if you sell through the cloud, if you one of those people that is trying to make money off the internet, in a few years, 3 years, 500 million potential customers. That is more than the US and very close to Europe. So it's an important continent, regardless of what you've heard. Now, the question then is innovation. So let's say you are the CTO of a startup that has global ambitions. You want 1 billion customers. Facebook has set the threshold pretty high. 1 billion customers means culturally significant, and that's what you want. You can't ignore 500 million potential customers in one continent. But the question is, if, for instance, you have investment plans, you have hiring plans, etc., is innovation one of those parameters you need to look out for when you assess Africa as a prospect? For the historically savvy, that may sound like a pretty naive question. After all, this is the continent that gave the world toothpaste, mascara, and the plow. So innovation is, in a way, something that has been associated with African DNA for a very long time, for thousands of years. And yet still, this is not a trivial question. The debate across the continent, among development agencies, among investors, does include the question of whether innovation is an important part of the African transformation question. And it's not surprising when you look at the raft of empirical research that has actually been conducted into this question. Nearly 98% of all the value that comes out of innovation accrues to imitators. 98%, that's a huge number. Nearly 98% of all the value that accrues out of innovation actually goes to imitators, not those who innovate. This is empirical research. I know of a professor who did a study of more than 400 firms in Switzerland in the 80s, late 80s. And even then, it was quite obvious that the imitators and the copycats rule. We have the world's second largest economy, and by some estimates, the next economic superpower, having done very well by copying with amazing grace and beauty. We've seen tremendous growth in the Indian IT economy, which by and large isn't really innovation-driven. Most people who outsource to India are interested in cost management. Sometimes they want to diversify risk. But fundamentally, they don't do it because of innovation. That notwithstanding, we've seen India make tremendous growth, or seen tremendous growth in its IT sector. And when we've talked about innovation in emerging markets, and terms like frugal innovation bubbles up, the early results are demonstrating that sometimes innovation doesn't go according to plan, particularly when the fundamental justification is cost. Two of the biggest frugal innovation projects that we've seen in India have either flopped or failed. The Akash tablet, which aimed to make the smallest, spec, and also cheapest tablet the world has ever seen. The Tata Nano, which aimed to make the world's cheapest car, didn't do spectacularly well. So innovation doesn't always go according to plan. True. True. So here's where I come in. My company is called mPedigree. You probably haven't heard of it. Started in Ghana, small country, west coast of Africa. And we started because there is a fascinating issue in the world. Everything you can think of, regardless of its value, can be faked. Everything you can think of. That is actually a Porsche. They make end-to-end Porsche vehicles that are fake. We've seen dinosaur bones. Everything you can think of can be faked. But when it begins to penetrate into those aspects of our lives that are critical, like medicines, I'm sure you'll agree that the discussion changes tone. And that's what started happening sometime on the border of Cambodia and Thailand, in the Mekong area. Doctors were beginning to see patients treated with medicines not get well. And when they digged deeper, it wasn't anything sophisticated, as initially anticipated, like the rise of microbial resistance, etc. It was the fact that people were making medicines that look like medicines. So what you're seeing there, you could pick it up in a pharmacy in Thailand, and there's absolutely nothing about it to raise any alarm. And yet still it's fake. It's almost like Russian crapshoots. Is that fake or is that genuine? And how do you tell? Say you go on holidays in Thailand, and while you're there, you have a little fever, and you walk into a pharmacy and you pick up a pack of antibiotics. You have something in 1 in 3 chances of taking something that can actually end your life. So it's a big problem. As many people die of fake medicines as that's if you were using an analogy. Imagine 2 jumbo jets crashing every day. That's just fake medicines, not fake other things. 2 jumbo jets crashing every day. So it's one of the biggest unreported disasters in the world. And when this problem surfaced, initially it was seen as exotica, something funny, interesting, curious, fascinating going on somewhere far away in the world. And then these fake medicines began to appear in the public health supply chains of Europe and America. So fake insulin, fake heparin. At that point, the world began to take notice. Because you're diabetic, you get your insulin, you find out that it's actually just a little water with some sprinkle of useless chemical substances. You could easily go into diabetic shock. And once a couple of them were found in the European and American supply chains, people had to do something about it. Initially, the idea was that it was an arms race. We're going to outsmart these counterfeiters, so we're going to develop systems that they can't copy. Because we're way too smart than, because we're smarter than them. If we produce something that was difficult for them to match up to, then we will beat them. So holograms, what you're looking there is a hologram, and that is one of the first attempts to solve this problem. Create something on the pack of medicine or product that is so difficult to copy that even if they copied the pack and the medicine itself, they couldn't copy that feature. That sounds smart, eh? The problem was that it didn't take long before the counterfeiters copied the hologram. But they didn't do it in exactly the same way that you did your hologram. They just put something shiny on there. So I walk into the pharmacy, I see, oh, that's shiny, good. I mean, how am I going to tell that is the fake hologram? Because where is the original hologram? Certainly not by me. In fact, it got to a point where some counterfeiters started to put holograms on fake products when the originals didn't have holograms. So you walk into the shop and you pick up the fake and go, no, I don't want that one. Yeah, he hasn't got a hologram. So arms races don't work. Now, the last study I saw, 50% of all the holograms protecting malaria medicines in the Mekong area have been successfully faked. That's a nice number for you, 50%. So that's 1 in 2 chances of picking up a fake drug. So people in the West, corporations in the West, they went back to the drawing board and they got this. Here's how they were going to solve counterfeiting. They were going to create a system where every medicine produced is counted. So what you do is you go to the pharmacy, let's say I produce 100 medicines, and then every time somebody buys one, you scan it, and you count all of them. So if there is any extra, you know you've got a fake. There's an alert. And that requires every pharmacy to be net-linked into the system, and you've got to put a little electronic chip into each pack that you can scan. So I don't know those of you that use, transit systems where you've got to scan a season ticket, maybe New York or New Jersey, those places. Yeah, similar. Put a little electronic chip into the packaging, and then let them scan it as it goes through the pharmacies. Netlink all the pharmacies together. Okay, also, make sure that your radio scanning is within a range where that scanning doesn't get interfered with by water or by glass or by anything we discover in 3 weeks' time. Complexity. 2 decades on, this system hasn't been launched into mass use anywhere in Europe and America. Now, when I encountered this problem and became aware of this context, that some of the smartest, richest, most powerful companies in the world, in the richest parts of the world, have been trying to solve it, and it's costing billions of dollars, and it's way over budget. California tried to do this in 1995. They are on their 4th postponement of the deadline for implementing these systems. Obviously, it was overwhelming. We decided to understand in great detail what the real problem was and to innovate around it. We came up with a system that enables the manufacturer to put a unique tag on each product with a unique code that can be used only once because the database records every instance that it comes in. And when you buy the medicine, you scratch off that panel and you send it by SMS for free. And you get a response that particular code is unique, and therefore the product you have is likely to be genuine. The reason being that we linked that particular code to every event in the supply chain post-manufacturing. So when the product moves from the factory to the warehouse, that's an event. When it moves from the warehouse to the port, that's an event. When it moves from the port to the retail center, that's an event. You link them all together, get a good algorithm, you generate a code that is in essence a consolidation of multiple events in the supply chain linked together, and you are able to tell the consumer without bothering them with all this stuff in an instant whether the medicine they have is important. What was critical about our innovation is that we brought a consumer back into the mix. All the other attempts to solve this problem around the world had involved big corporations, big government agencies, a lot of billions of dollars, and not a little guy. This was the fundamental difference. Once we brought consumers to the center of it, the entire landscape shifted, the innovation was completely transformed, and we started very simply like I showed to you, but then we continue to innovate. And that, in my view, is actually the fundamental principle of African innovation, something we call serial micro-innovations, little changes that continue to transform the original innovation fundamentally over time. And if you're a social entrepreneur and your goal is really to solve the problem, not just to make some money, so you really want to uproot the problem, then serial innovation becomes the path towards that. So we've got to the stage now where we are beginning to use all the data coming from all the people sending the SMS to triangulate the locations where the counterfeiting is happening, and our goal is to predict where the counterfeiting will happen next. But that is not what I want to share with you today. What I want to share with you today is that our approach of transcending the complexity in Europe and America led to fundamentally different constraints and parameters for our solution. One, our solution had to be about 1% the unit cost of the approaches that were being used in Europe and America. So if I pick up a pack of medicine and I want to protect it in the European or American model, the cost is 100 times what it will cost you if you use the mPedigree approach. The overall investment requirement had to be about 0.5%. The time from initiation to completion of the project, 1/10. These are fundamental design constraints, very, very difficult to achieve. The return on investment had to be 5x. It will please you to know that today every single anti-malaria pack in Nigeria is tracked from manufacturing through the warehouse, through the port, to the consumer. Every single person who takes an anti-malaria is a data point in a system that continues to evolve and can be used for epidemiological management, can be used for so many other transformative aspects of the healthcare system. And Nigeria is nearly a decade ahead of most of Europe, and certainly a decade ahead of the United States. That is innovation. And the reason it's innovation is you have something, a guy called Oliver Wendell Holmes. There are two of them with the same name that are quite famous in history. One was a US judge. This one, on the other hand, was some kind of philosopher. And his goal was that, or his philosophy was that, it doesn't matter the simplicity that you encounter before you've crossed complexity. The only simplicity you need to respect is the simplicity that emerges after you've crossed complexity. Why does all of this matter? Because Africa is a very complex place. Way more languages than any of you can ever fathom. I come from a country that has a population of just 25 million. There are 44 written languages and more than 100 other dialects. Think about that. In Nigeria, every 20 kilometers you walk, the language changes. You haven't seen the degree of complexity I'm talking about until you've experienced it up close. Why is that important? It is important because in such an environment, innovations that emerge are likely to only survive after they've transcended complexity. And my argument to you is that, like biodiversity, these kinds of innovations are globally useful. They are part of our cognitive heritage as a species. Why do we preserve biodiversity? Because the environmental conditions differ from one part of the world to the other. And some of the species that will thrive in one part of the world will not thrive in another. And therefore, some of the benefits that mankind may earn from biodiversity can only happen in certain parts of the world. So the Chinese discovered the best drug against malaria to date. It came from nature, not from the laboratory. Artemisinin. And if the Chinese didn't have the environmental conditions that allowed that plant to thrive, we wouldn't have the best medicine for malaria. What else could we discover somewhere else? A cure for tuberculosis? But that's just biodiversity. What about innovation? The fact that some environments are so different from the environment in the United States and in Europe means that people in these parts of the world will come up with innovations that are radically different from anything you have experienced. And because it's still a global planet, it is still one humanity, we should take it as important that these innovations are not lost due to lack of care and attention. The cognitive heritage of mankind is a resource for all of us. And that is why African innovations, African innovators, young Africans that could become innovators, young Africans that could produce innovations are so important. The next global epidemic is likely to come from somewhere other than the United States or Europe or Japan. Because these are the places where the connection with nature is unbroken. And most of the diseases that we have seen that truly, truly are frightening jump from one species to the other. So those that are in proximity to nature are likely to encounter these diseases first, as we saw with Ebola. Now, when they lack the capacity locally to innovate to solve their own problems, these front lines of defense will be breached. And the globe cannot contain the spillover. So local innovation capacity is critical to address problems like the current migrant crisis that we are seeing, to create new jobs in the developing world due to the complexity that I mentioned, due to the low infrastructure that I mentioned. You require innovation. If innovation fails to produce those jobs, those migrants will spill over into Europe and America, whether you like it or not. No barrier can keep them out. For those people to live lives that are fulfilling and meaningful in their own countries, they do need the ability to create jobs, sustainable development, and a life that affords them some basic dignity. And given the complexities of these environments, it is quite critical, absolutely critical, that innovation is introduced as fundamentally critical in the way that they solve their problems and do not burden the rest of the world. That is the only way globalization, as a global phenomenon, can benefit all of us. That's my pitch to you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome founding executive editor, Wired Magazine, Kevin Kelly.
Hi. Wow, it's great to be here. So I want to talk about the next 20 or 30 years in technology. I've been thinking a lot about that, and there's a lot of ways in which most of what's going to happen is really not predictable, but there's a lot that we can say is inevitable. And I want to talk about two of the most important forces that I see at work in the next 25 years. You've probably heard about these, but I hope to be able to tell you a little bit about what this looks like culturally. Give you another avenue into this, something you think you've heard about, but maybe I can explain it in a different way. Those two forces that I think are going to be fundamental in the next 25 years, touching almost every aspect of our lives. The first one is artificial intelligence. And I use the word cognify to talk about this because artificial intelligence has a lot of cultural baggage. We have lots of things associated. We think we know what it is. But in fact, I don't think we do know what it is. And I use the word to cognify things because I think this cognification means to make things smarter. So let me talk about this artificial intelligence that we're about to come upon. Already it's happening. It's already here. We know that this is a trend because it's been happening for a very long time. Mostly it's happening in the back of offices where you might in the hospital, they're diagnosing x-rays better than a human right now. Or in a medical field where they are going through evidence better than a human lawyer. Of course, when you fly an airplane long distance, most of the time, the AI is flying except for the 7 or 8 minutes that the human pilots take over. And even your little chip in your wheels in the brake of your car are braking better than a human right now. So these are all examples of AIs that have been in our lives and they've been invisible. But of course, recently, something's happened. We've had a technological perfect storm where 3 different technologies came together to produce a whole new generation of artificial intelligence that has now been able to do things like AlphaGo, which was to beat the world's best Go player. So we have a sense in which there is a new round of AI. Most of it is running on neural nets, which imitate the human brain. And they're running off of really large sets of data. The key was understanding that actually we had to train these not with just a couple thousands of examples, but with millions of examples. And that was what a lot of the companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft had, is they were sitting on huge data sets that could be used to train these AIs. Google recently took their AI and used it to teach an AI how to play a video game. Now, of course, AI has been playing video games forever. But this was teaching an AI how to learn to play the game. So they just showed that the kind of simple early 70s Atari games, and by watching the pixels on the screen was able to learn how to play the game. And within 250 minutes or more, it could actually beat most humans. So this was artificial learning, so to speak. This artificial smartness is in fact a better way to think about this kind of AI rather than HAL 9000 or something that's like humans, because it's a different kind of thinking. So your calculator is smarter than you are already in arithmetic. Your GPS is smarter than you are in spatial navigation. Your search engine is already smarter than you are in recall. Google, Bing, these kinds of search engines can remember every single word on 60 trillion web pages. That's just inhuman in terms of its capability. And so when we have this AI learning to drive an auto-driven car like that Google car, the reason why we want it to drive a car is because it's not driving like a human. It's a different kind of thinking. It's not being distracted. It's not wondering about whether it should have majored in finance or whether it left the stove on. It is focused 100% on optimizing driving, okay? And in fact, the fact that it doesn't have consciousness, is not conscious of itself, is actually probably a benefit. And we may actually come to start to advertise AIs as being conscious-free as a benefit because it's not being distracted. And the important thing is that these kinds of thinkings are not human-like. And that's an important thing as we try to imagine the consequences of this artificial intelligence, is to keep remembering that by and large they're not going to be human-like in their intelligence. Because our own intelligence has a very, very misguided, uninformed understanding of our own intelligence, of what it is. We generally have a kind of a cartoon vision of what intelligence is. We tend to imagine it as a single dimension, like decibel, like loudness, that gets louder and louder and starts kind of quiet, like in a mouse or a rat, and then it can go up into a chimpanzee and kind of a stupid person, an average person, a genius, the AI. That's the common use. We talk about IQ points, and even the AI researchers sometimes use this vocabulary of a single dimension, and it's absolutely wrong. It's a very incorrect vision of what intelligence is. Intelligence is closer to, I would call it a symphony of a suite of different types of thinking. There are dozens of different modes of intelligence in our brains, from deductive reasoning, symbolic reasoning, emotional intelligence. We can probably start to list dozens and dozens, and we've only just begun to kind of explore what those possibilities are. And of course, they vary from person to person, and of course, they vary just in general amplitude, some being very strong and some being not so strong. And so that is this suite, this symphony of different notes played on different instruments, and each of those instruments is a different way of thinking. And when we think about animals, it's a similar setup where there's also a suite, a concert, a symphony of different notes being played on different instruments, but some of those instruments may actually be the same kind of thinking that appears in human, but we may have a different amplitude. So in some cases, some animals, like a squirrel, have a long-term memory that far exceeds humans because they have to remember where they've buried their nuts for years and years and years. In other cases, those kinds of intelligence will be much less than ours, and in some cases, the suite, the total variety may be less. But when we come to make artificial, mechanical machine minds, we're going to do a very similar thing of taking many different types of thinking and putting them together. And in some cases, we're going to exaggerate or exceed our own human capabilities in certain kinds of thinking. And of course, other types of thinking may not be as strong as ours because it isn't necessary. And in this case, the universal engineering limit is holding true, which is that you cannot optimize everything. It's impossible to optimize all dimensions. You always have to have a trade-off. You always have an engineering trade-off. And so there can't be a perfect intelligence in all dimensions. There can only be some kind of engineering trade-off. And if you elevate one kind, you're taking resources to do another type. And so there is no such thing as a general purpose intelligence. Humans do not have a general purpose intelligence. We have an intelligence that's been evolved for millions of years to survive against all the other animals on this planet. So it's a very particular, peculiar, specific kind of intelligence. But what we're doing now with technology is that we're using technology to invent other kinds of thinking, other kinds of intelligences. In fact, we're not just different suites of them, but in fact, different types of thinking that haven't existed before. So just like we invented a new way to fly, so natural evolution on this planet invented flapping wings and gliders and spinning things, humans invented a type of flying, which is you take a barn door and you attach it to a jet and it takes off and flies. That was not something that we saw in nature. So this was a different type of flying. It's artificial flight. We're inventing different modes of thinking, entirely new modes of thinking, and entirely new kinds of minds. And these minds are very, very valuable because there are probably certain difficult problems in business and in science that may exceed our human capability of solving, where we actually may need to solve it in a two-step process of first inventing a different kind of thinking that can work with us to solve these very difficult problems. So there may be things like quantum gravity, dark energy, things like that. The unification of the different fields in physics may require us to actually invent other types of thinking so that together we can work together to solve those kind of problems. Even in business, there may be lots of new uses and new kinds of minds that we will develop and invent in order to solve certain problems. So what we're kind of doing is filling the possibility space with all these different types of minds. And we may have hundreds of different species of thinking as we go forward. What we get out of this is really kind of like alien intelligences. You might even think about these AIs as not artificial intelligences, but alien intelligences, or artificial aliens for that matter, in the sense that they are thinking different. And of course, thinking different is the foundation of innovation and wealth in the new economy, thinking different. How can you think different while remain connected to 7 billion people? It's a really big challenge because AIs think differently. They are actually going to be an asset to us as we go forward. So that's one aspect of artificial intelligence, is that the fact that it's not that it's more superior than humans because they already are in certain dimensions, but the fact that they're different than humans. And that also will come in a consequence later on when we think about the jobs that we have, because, again, they're thinking different, not like humans. The second important aspect of artificial intelligence is as birthing in us, our society, a second industrial revolution. Everybody knows about the first one. It built everything that we see surrounding us here, and that prosperity, that abundance came about primarily through one general invention, which I would call artificial power. Before this, through the agriculture age and the hunter-gatherer age, the only way to make something was with natural power, which was muscle power, whether it's our own muscles or animal muscles. That was the only way to make things. Muscle power, if you wanted to build something big, you had to have a lot of muscle power. If you wanted to build a road, it was muscle power all the way. That was very limiting. It was limited in what we could make or do. Then we invented artificial power, and we were able to harness water power, steam power, electric power, gasoline power, and it was that artificial power that enabled us to build the city that we're in right now, enabled us to build these factories that churn out the chairs that we're all sitting in and our clothes. And even today, when you drive down the highway at 60 miles an hour, you just turn a little switch and you suddenly harness the equivalent of 250 horses. That muscle power, 250 horses is right there. Just turning it on, there you got it. You can do whatever you want with that 250 horses. You can throw up a skyscraper if you wanted to. You can make a locomotive going across. This was an incredible power that we had, and that power was very quickly distributed to everybody on a grid, the electrical grid, where it went throughout the entire land, and even someone in the most remote farm could have access to that power. They didn't have to generate it themselves. It became a commodity, a utility. And that was also, again, a great source of innovation and entrepreneurship, because a farmer who might have been working with a manual water pump up and down could have an idea, oh, hey, I'll take this pump and I'll add some artificial power and I'll make an electric pump. Multiply that by thousands, if not millions of times, and that's the Industrial Revolution. Take something, add artificial power, and now you have something that was going to change our lives. And so our lives are transformed because we have multiplied that artificial power with everything that we have done. Everything in our entire society now is running off of this artificial power. If it was gone, we would not have the society that we have now. So we're going to do the same thing again, but even more so by taking that electric pump, and then we're going to add some artificial intelligence, and then we're going to have the smart pump, okay? And we're going to multiply that by thousands and thousands of times. So now, in addition to that 250 horses that we have in a car, we're going to take the car and add 250 minds. They're not human minds, but 250 minds, and we have the auto-driven car. That combination of taking all the stuff, we have artificial power, and now adding artificial intelligence is this recipe for this transformation. So everything that we have electrified, we're now going to cognify. Okay? And this cognification will be delivered on a grid called the cloud. And like electricity, it will be a commodity. And just like the farmer, you'll just simply buy as much of it as you want. Okay? And you'll use it, and it'll be a source of innovation and creativity and power and transformation for everything we touch, from entertainment to sports to whatever it is. And the recipe is sort of take something and add AI to it. And I would suggest even that the next 10,000, the recipe for the next 10,000 startups is very simple, which is take X and add AI. Take something that's not obvious and add AI to it. Take a taxi cab, that old-fashioned, boring taxi cab, add AI, you get Uber. We're going to do that again and again and again, and that is what we're headed into, where we're taking everything that we've already added artificial power to, now we're going to add artificial intelligence. And again, this is not the intelligence of humans. This is other kinds of minds. And so the question you want to be asking yourself is, what could you do with 1,000 minds working for you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? What would you do with that? They're not humanized, but they're smart. There's artificial smartness into some capacity. And by the way, right now, right this minute, you can buy that AI from Google and others. They're selling it 6 cents, 100 queries. It's very cheap. And in fact, Google has announced just 2 days ago that they are moving from being a mobile-centric company to an AI-centric company, because this is the power that we're being unleashed, this new second industrial revolution that will affect everything. Take X, add AI. So the second thing I want to talk about, the second force that is really, I think, fundamentally going to become dominant in our culture in 25 years starts with this idea that we keep wanting to interact with our technology more and more, and we have more and more ways to do it. And we start with the fact that basically, our lives are surrounded with screens. There's a couple big screens here. I have screens in front of me. You have screens in your pocket. In China, they have whole cities that are nothing but screens. And when we watch things, it's not just the one screen. We've got second screen and the third screen. And we keep wanting to interact with all this stuff. We want to increase the interaction. And it's not just typing. That's not good enough anymore, or pushing buttons like on the Jetsons. We want to use our whole body. We want to kind of dance, choreography. I worked on this movie with Steven Spielberg and Peter Schwartz, who's now at Dreamforce, and we were trying to imagine what the future of computer would be in 2050, and we say, well, you'd use your big arm gestures. You would open up and you would almost like move data like you were a choreographer or a conductor. And the Iron Man movie picked up the same idea of using your entire body to interact with your device. And it's not just the big gestures, it's even the small gestures. They have little kind of nano radar chips that can detect micro gestures of your fingers and also the micro expressions on your face. Because whatever screen you're looking at is basically going to be looking back at you. And their software is now good enough to discern up to 25 different human emotions. And so it can tell whether you are perplexed or distracted or afraid or perplexed or in some ways what your emotion is, and it can respond to you in that way, in your emotions, in the detail of your face. And of course, it's not just our body. We're very rapidly headed to having a conversational interface with the Amazon Echo and the Google Home and the Microsoft Assistants, where we're going to converse with these things. And the internet will become not so much a place that we go to as much as a presence that we converse with. And the ultimate way to interact with our technology is actually to go into it, to fall right into it, to dive right into the technology. And that's what virtual reality is, basically. VR, virtual reality. You put the goggles on, and you're somewhere else. You go into the device, so to speak. And that really does work. If you haven't had a chance to try a modern set, it really does transport you somewhere else. And it does that in a way that we're not even sure how it does it, but it does that by working on a different part of your brain than what you normally see when you're looking at a flat screen. And there's right now two kinds of virtual reality. There's the immersive type, which I just talked about. You put a pair of goggles on, and that's called VR. There's another type called AR, or sometimes MR, mixed reality, where you wear a pair of goggles that are clear like this, and you put it on, and then insert it into the room that you're really in, or your kitchen, or your office space. You have these virtual presence of objects or people into your real world. And that MR is mixed reality, and it's actually technically more difficult to do than VR. But if you can do MR, you can do VR, basically. And so that's where a lot of the money is going, and that's the most difficult thing to do, and it's the most powerful in many ways, because you can kind of imagine a world of mixed reality where if you're designing something, you actually see the actual scale. It's right there. You can actually use your hands to virtually manipulate it, to take it apart. It's fantastic for learning and education, because for people who need their whole body or like to learn with their hands, this is a way to engage in a very fundamental way. And of course, you can also make virtual screens. And having immersed myself in these for all the current prototypes, it's actually amazing that Those virtual screens are as clear to read as a book. I can watch a high-definition movie on the virtual screen with great ease. And so Microsoft and others believe that this is the future of the office, where you have as many screens as you want, instantly wherever you are. And by the way, what are we going to do in this auto-driven car? When the robot's driving our cars, what are we going to do? VR. Right? I mean, what you want is you want to step into the car that you don't have to drive, and immediately you put your thing on and you're at work or continuing your story. You have an experience that you're somewhere else other than in a car. And this mixed reality, the power of it, actually was demonstrated recently with Pokemon Go. Even though that virtuality was very, very crude, it just showed the power of mixing the two, of bringing that VR into the real world, and the power that we have from mixing these up. Most of what we get in virtual reality is not just what we see. It's more than half of that comes from the other senses, like listening and touch. And when all these things work and conspire together, you have an incredible experience. The common demonstration for virtual reality is to have somebody stand on the edge of a room, you put the goggles on, and then suddenly they drop the floor away, and it's like a mile down. And even though your brain, your conscious brain knows that you're just standing in the same room you were, your body feels like you're going to die. You have to get back. Your legs are shaking. You're nauseous. Because virtual reality is working on a different part of your brain. It's the back of the part of the brain. And when you take the goggles off and after you've been in a virtual reality world, you don't remember seeing things. You remember experiencing them. So what this is doing is shifting the internet from an internet of knowledge and information to an internet of experiences. And that's what we're going to buy. We're going to download an experience. We're going to trade an experience. We're going to purchase an experience. We're going to share experiences. So experiences become the new currency. They are the things that we're experiencing. And that's what becomes really valuable. And so it's not just thrills. This can be the experience of having someone who sits next to you while you're sick or ill. It could be someone showing you a demonstration. It could be going to a place where humans can't normally get to, underwater, where you actually feel as if you're there, the edge of a volcano, into space. And by the way, everybody's experience of virtual reality so far has reinforced one amazing fact, which is the most interesting thing to see in virtual reality is not artificial worlds, not artificial objects, but other people. And that way, virtual reality is going to become the most social of all the social media. I had the pleasure and the privilege of experiencing a telepresence of another being. This is a Microsoft demonstration. And the entire, I could see every thread in the person's clothes, every hair, and they were moving and talking, and it really, really felt as if that person was there. I knew that they weren't, but it felt, because it's something is happening in a different part of your brain, it felt as if they were there, even though I know they weren't. And even the cartoon version of VR works, because even though that's kind of cartoon version, those avatars have the complete body language of that person, because they're collecting the body language, they have the same voice, and they have eye contact. And that is enough to convince you that you feel as if they're there, even though you know they're not. And so this movement to this world of experiences, which is really what VR is going to be about, and why many people, and including me, think that it's the thing that's after smartphones. So those are the two main things. But the other last thing I want to close, and just to give you one hint about the future, is that often the future is really difficult to believe. It's really hard to believe in what's coming. It seems impossible. It seems crazy. It seems ridiculous. I was talking about computers becoming so cheap that we would put them in our shoes, in our chairs, in our clothes, in our doors, and people thought that was ridiculous. Why would you put a computer in a door? Well, you can't go into a hotel today without a computer in a door. They track everything. It's housekeeping. So we have to believe the impossible more often. We really have to open up our minds to these things. And we're just right now at the beginning of day one of this stuff. Okay? I mean, there are no AI or VR experts. We don't know it. Compared to what we're going to know in 25 years, we know nothing right now. And when we think about what's happening in, the next even 20 years, we have to kind of open up our minds, because despite the fact that I believe that AI and VR are going to be the most important things in the next 20 years, after that, I think we have no idea what's going to be. It's probably nothing that has been invented today, right? The most important thing, say, in 30 years will be invention that does not exist today. And that is a very important thing, because it means that you are not late. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.